Olá a todos, sejam bem-vindos a mais um Tempo de Amazônia. Meu nome é Daniel Vargas, eu sou professor de Economia e Direito na Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Estou aqui nessa tarefa de conduzir e receber alguns convidados com experiência ou com contribuição ímpar para a Amazônia. Hoje nós temos a honra de ter conosco o doutor Marek Hanusch, que é economista sênior do Banco Mundial, local em que ele trabalha há muitos anos, em particular com experiência na área de comércio, investimento e macroeconomia em geral. Marek tem uma experiência e uma formação intelectual ímpar, tem se dedicado ao longo dos anos a entender e a pensar os desafios do desenvolvimento, em particular em regiões como a África, mas também no Brasil. E há pouco tempo, o Banco Mundial, sobre a coordenação de Marek, divulgou um estudo bastante ambicioso, tentando diagnosticar e oferecer propostas e caminhos para o desenvolvimento da Amazônia. Nas palavras do report, intitulado A Balancing Act for Brazil's Amazonian States, uma das ideias é pensar em como recalibrar esse projeto e modelo de desenvolvimento que prevalece na Amazônia, com o objetivo de conduzi-la a mais prosperidade com mais sustentabilidade. Agora eu vou conduzir a nossa conversa em inglês. Marek, it's a pleasure to talk to you. Welcome.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
So one of the key ideas of the report, if I understand, or actually three of the main ideas of the report is, first, in the short term, we should think of ways to halt deforestation. In parallel, it's important to somehow improve the governance structure of the Amazon, especially in the areas of land and forest protection. And in the long term, or in parallel, we need to create the basis for a new growth model. I'd like to hear from you, what's your analysis of what the critical problem of the Amazon is? How exactly do you understand the challenge of the region? And what exactly is the path we should follow in order to bring about this area of prosperity with sustainability and improvement of the welfare of the people of the Amazon?
Daniel, thank you for inviting me. And let me explain very quickly why the World Bank is doing such a report. And as your viewers will probably know, the World Bank is an international financial institution with a mandate to reduce poverty and inequality in a sustainable way. Brazil is a member of the World Bank, and therefore we support the Brazilian government in its own development efforts. And as part of this, we conduct studies like the one that you've just mentioned, the Balancing Act for Brazil's Amazonian states. And because Brazil is such a big country in the federation, we do some of these reports at the subnational level to really focus on the 9 states of the legal Amazon for this particular study. And why do we focus on those states? Well, on the one hand, there are real needs. So about a third or over a third of people, those 28 million people who live in these 9 states of the legal Amazon are considered poor by international standards. So there's a real need to promote development in these Amazon states. And at the same time, as everybody knows, these states are home to about 60% of the Amazon rainforest, as well as other really important biomes like the Cerrado and the Pantanal. And these are really areas of global significance. They're important for Brazil, they're important for Latin America, and they're important for the world. So preserving this natural capital while at the same time promoting economic growth is the objective that we share with the Brazilian government. And that is what the report is looking at. So what was very interesting in this study was that, first of all, there's a huge literature in Brazil and internationally on the Amazon. And we were very lucky that we could use that literature, learn from the literature, and base ourselves in that literature. So many of the things that we say just reconfirm the thinking that already exists. There are just a couple of areas that are potentially novel. And that has more to do with the links between Brazil's growth model and deforestation in the Amazon. And what was particularly interesting about the work as we did it was to see that the Amazon story really is very much tied in with a broader Brazilian story. And as your viewers will know, economic growth has been relatively low over the last decade. There have been more challenges to create jobs, to reduce poverty, to reduce inequality. Deforestation has been rising, and all of this is essentially connected. That's what the report shows. Because the report establishes linkages between economic development and land use in the Amazon, or in these 9 states of the legal Amazon. And it's really fascinating. If you just look at a graph of productivity in Brazil, and you overlay that with deforestation in the Amazon, you will find a very strong correlation. And this is just a correlation, but what the report shows is that actually there's more to this. There are causal mechanisms behind this. And that is what we try to explain in the report. So the World Bank has been doing a lot of research on Brazil for quite some time. And we have been pointing out Brazil's difficulty in raising economic growth because Brazil still relies on a growth model that accumulates factors of production. Now that sounds maybe a little complicated, but what it essentially means is factor accumulation is that Brazil accumulates labor, so that's a demographic story. Brazil accumulates capital, which is a savings and investment story, and both savings and investments are actually relatively weak in Brazil. And the third factor of production, in addition to labor and capital, is land. So when you talk about a growth model based on factor accumulation, you accumulate labor, capital, and land. And land accumulation is literally frontier expansion. Frontier expansion is what is happening in the legal Amazon as land is eventually being converted for productive usage. And some of that, or most of that actually, is eventually linked to agriculture. Even the land grabbing is done eventually with the expectation that at some point this land will be used agriculturally. That is what gives the value to the land that is being grabbed. So this frontier expansion has obviously been happening across the globe for the last 12,000 years. It has now arrived in the Amazon. And what the report shows is that stopping this type of model that has been so persistent across the world is not easy. And it requires a different type of thinking about this issue. And what is really interesting about Brazil is that very often when we talk about climate and development, we see trade-offs. But in Brazil, the story is different. It's not necessarily a trade-off. Because when you think about what I just said about this correlation between productivity and deforestation, a country like Brazil is an upper middle income country. It's a relatively rich country. For countries like this, factor accumulation cannot be the solution anymore for growth. Countries that are as developed as Brazil need productivity gains. And these productivity gains essentially pull the pressure off the agricultural frontier by using factors of production more efficiently. So productivity across Brazil promotes income growth, it generates jobs, including in the legal Amazon, and it also reduces these deforestation pressures in the legal Amazon. But in Brazil, productivity growth is extremely weak. It has really been stagnant over the last years. And where productivity growth happens are relatively small sectors, and they're mostly linked to commodities. So they're linked to agriculture and they're linked to mining. So productivity gains do happen in those sectors. And that's a good thing. I mean, productivity gains are always a good thing. Where they do not occur so much are these more urban sectors, the manufacturing, many services sector. In fact, in manufacturing, productivity has been decreasing over the past decades. So it's that imbalance in the economy that needs to be readjusted. And agriculture is only 7% of GDP. Mining is also small in GDP. Manufacturing and services are much bigger sectors in GDP. And these sectors are also really important for an economy like Brazil that is so urbanized. So many people in Brazil live in towns and cities. And they need jobs in the manufacturing and services sectors because those are the sectors that produce in towns and cities. So that is where the report shows that raising productivity, including in manufacturing and services, so sectors beyond commodities, will also eventually take the focus off the agricultural frontier. It will reduce deforestation pressures in the longer term. And at the same time, it will raise incomes. So this is a Brazilian story as much as it is a legal Amazon story. And these productivity gains across the economy matter in Brazil, and they matter also in the legal Amazon.
Great, Marek. So yes, productivity should be seen as one of the key engines based on which we should think about new path for the development of the Amazon. And doing that, we need to be able to also understand what the challenges are to foster these productivity gains in different sectors. And I wanted to start here hearing you a little bit more on to which extent this increase of productivity in the agribusiness sector is part of the solution to the Amazon, or in your understanding, it is part of the problem. And the reason I'm asking that is because we've seen over the last years or over the last decades a significant increase in this capacity of production in the agricultural sector using less resources with 2 or 3 crops over the same area. And to some extent, this also means the capacity of the sector to do more with less pressure on the environment. But on the other hand, the report sometimes seems to indicate that this should also be a reason for concern. So I just would like to hear your point of view on that.
Yeah, Daniel, that is a $1 million question. And honestly, this is an unsettled debate in the literature. So we have seen different views on the impact of agricultural productivity on deforestation. And I can tell you what our own report finds. And I think it is, in a way, a reconciliation of different findings in the literature with a bit of nuance. So what you just described actually has names. So there is the Borlaug effect. The Borlaug effect means that when agriculture becomes more productive, it uses all factors of production more efficiently, and that includes land. So a more productive agriculture sector uses less land, and therefore there's less deforestation. And at the global level, that is probably true. And interestingly, across Brazil, we do find this effect as well. So when you raise productivity across the country, deforestation tends to go down. But then there's another story, and that also has a name. It is called the Jevons paradox or the Jevons effect. And that means that when you raise agricultural productivity, deforestation increases. And that is due to the fact that more productive farmers are also more competitive farmers. So they do become more efficient, but they also want to take market share from other producers. So they expand their production, and in that process, even though they're more efficient, they will also deforest more. And this phenomenon you can find in particular in frontier regions. And the reason for that is that when you are on the agricultural frontier and there's a lot of land, that land is still relatively cheap, especially when there is insufficient forest governance, there's poor law enforcement, forests are not protected. In practice, that land is relatively cheap, and it's relatively cheap to convert forests for agricultural use. It is exactly in those circumstances that the Jevons effect often emerges. So on agricultural frontiers, agricultural productivity can cause deforestation. And that is also what we observe in our report. So agricultural productivity across Brazil reduces deforestation, but agricultural productivity only in the states of the legal Amazon actually increases deforestation in the legal Amazon. So obviously there are 2 solutions to this at a minimum. The obvious one is we need better land and forest governance, because if it is illegal to convert forests for agricultural use, then there will be no deforestation by definition. But we know that in Brazil that has been relatively difficult. These governance challenges are quite pronounced. And when you think about what I tried to say earlier, when the growth model is one of factor accumulation and frontier expansion is part of this growth model, then it is very difficult politically to stop that through governance. So that is where this urban story comes in again. So when you raise productivity in these urban sectors, in manufacturing and services, it actually reduces demand for agricultural land because these sectors do not use land as a production input. So when you combine now productivity gains in the legal Amazon, in agriculture, and in manufacturing, what you find is a cancellation of these impacts on forests. So the net impact is actually zero. So when you have the same amount of productivity gains in manufacturing and agriculture in the Amazon, more deforestation. So that is where we talk about balancing the growth model. It is really important that when we talk about agricultural productivity, we also talk about manufacturing and services productivity. And obviously, when there's much less pressure to deforest, basically the demand to convert forests into agricultural land is lower, it also becomes easier politically to protect the forests and to enforce these environmental protection provisions that already exist in Brazilian law.
Right. So we have here with us Marek Hanusch. Marek is a senior economist at the World Bank, and he's the editor and coordinator of a recent report released by the World Bank, which diagnoses and suggests a path to recalibrate, as the World Bank suggests, the model of growth that has actually prevailed in the Amazon over the last few decades, I would say. So now we are going to a short break, and we come back very soon to talk about the future and how exactly we should act to bring about this new model of development in the region. So we're back to our Tempo de Amazônia. We have with us Marek Hanusch, a senior economist at the World Bank. In the first part of our dialogue, Marek, you talked about the challenge of, on the one hand, creating a structure that diminishes this productivity rise in the rural areas. If I understood well, the argument would be that as productivity rises at the frontiers, for example, in the state of the Amazon, in the state of Mato Grosso, or eventually even the Amazonas state, one of the consequences that this has in the Amazon is an increasing pressure over the forest and therefore higher levels of deforestation. I'd like to push a little bit this assumption and hear your points of view on it. So if we take the state of Mato Grosso, and I'm stressing the state of Mato Grosso because the report is actually using that state as a reference of what would be a problem. So according to the report, if the whole Amazon followed the path of Mato Grosso, we would actually wipe out the forest. That's the expression of the report. And I wonder whether that is the appropriate or the best understanding of what's going on in Mato Grosso and even in the region. So if you take the whole area of agriculture in the Mato Grosso state now, it covers about 10% of the area of the state. And about 17 or 18% are areas that are protected, reserved areas. And the majority of the area of the state is still very much preserved. So to one extent, yes, the state of Mato Grosso is a paradigm in the increase of productivity in the production of soybeans and other commodities. And following that development, the state is also one that has actually experienced higher levels of social welfare. To which extent the state of Mato Grosso could really be characterized as an example of the problem for the region? Let me add you one extra factor. So over the last few years, the state of Mato Grosso actually has the rates of deforestation relatively lower to what it actually experienced 10 or 15 years ago, even though in the last year it has begun to rise again. So I just would like to open the ground and hear your points of view on how exactly we should frame this understanding of which state is a problem which state is a solution in the Brazilian Amazon?
Yeah, I think all states, and that's what we try to highlight in the report, that there are good practices to be found in all states. And Mato Grosso has indeed made huge efforts in recent years to protect its forests. But we also know that deforestation rates have been high in Mato Grosso in the past. And when we talk about the Amazon, we really have to worry about tipping points. And deforestation really must stop immediately. There is very little room, if any, to continue with deforestation. As per government commitments, deforestation needs to stop in the next few years. So to achieve this, we really have to think about ways in which deforestation can be reduced much, much more quickly. And that requires us to think a little more about ways in which this can be achieved. They can still allow states in the Amazon to become economic success stories like Mato Grosso. Mato Grosso today is one of the richest states in Brazil. But Mato Grosso has actually also experienced this urban productivity that we have been talking about. So Mato Grosso is increasingly experiencing urban productivity growth, and that will also help the state eventually reduce deforestation pressures, not only in the own state, but also in the region, because these macroeconomic forces really work across the region. So Mato Grosso, by investing in its cities, by investing in forest protection, is really leading the way again. In other states across the legal Amazon, this is also something that we propose should be considered to really avoid furthering deforestation and promoting export-led agriculture, initially through extensive forms of farming and eventually through productivity. So obviously, raising productivity can reduce these deforestation pressures if these other things hold. So that's exactly what the report says. You can raise agricultural productivity without hurting the forest if there is, on the one hand, very strong governance of forests, and on the other hand, matching urban productivity gains to balance the growth model across the economy, including agriculture and other economic sectors.
Great. So one of the proposals or directions which the report suggests us to think about in order to raise productivity in urban areas is to develop, if I understand well, a network of strategic cities that could actually be based in each of the states, beginning with the main capitals, and they could be somehow the new center of gravity to pull new investments and new quality of services and new ideas and a new economy for the future. How exactly would that network of cities work? So what is that the World Bank is actually proposing?
Yeah, so we call these nodes. So there are economic nodes and there are services nodes. In economic nodes, you will have sufficient scale, you will have a minimum level of infrastructure, skills, and so on and so forth, that there could actually be urban production in sectors that could eventually be sold to other parts of Brazil or even other parts of the world. So Manaus obviously is one of the big cities in the Amazon that already has significant urban potential for production, a very developed manufacturing sector. Another big city in the Amazon is Belém, as well as the other state capitals that have a size where we estimate that these could become centers for production that could eventually be sold to the rest of Brazil or the rest of the world. What's also quite interesting is, especially about cities in the Amazon biome, is that many of these cities are actually connected by river. And river transportation can be a real asset because, in theory, water transportation can be relatively cost effective, especially compared to roads. And obviously, it also has the advantage of avoiding some of the pitfalls of roads that have been associated with deforestation. So a network of cities connected by rivers would likely reduce some of these drivers of deforestation that we have been observing related to the expansion of rural roads. And then there are many smaller cities in the Amazon, towns and cities, And not all of these cities will have the same economic potential. And it will be relatively unrealistic to expect of these smaller cities to have this potential, especially if they're really far away from bigger markets. However, these cities still play extremely important functions as what we call services nodes. So as services nodes, they are connected to the network of city, to the bigger cities, and they provide services to the region, to the villages in the area that they serve. They provide public administration, they provide health, they provide education, and they provide a skills foundation for people to either work in those cities or to move on to bigger cities, to move on to the rest of the country. So by connecting all of these places, you can really generate the foundation for the human capital and for the productive capabilities that would be required to make this urban Amazonia, if you will, more competitive within Brazil and the world. And that would generate jobs and it would reduce deforestation pressures. And what's really important to remember here, this story really matters for the states of the legal Amazon because it is a region that's already quite urbanized. So 76% of Brazilians in the legal Amazon already live in towns and cities. And that process of urbanization is not actually over. So when you look at urbanization rates and you compare them to the level of development of any particular region, you will see that higher levels of development are always associated with higher rates of deforestation. Higher rates of urbanization. So what is going to happen in the states of the legal Amazon is that as they become richer, they develop, they produce more, people are going to continue to move to these urban areas. It will be critical that these nodes, these economic nodes, the services nodes, can generate jobs for the people who are there and for the people who are yet to come.
Great. But obviously, such a significant and deep change in the way the region is organized, shifting its center of gravity from rural production to urban cities, and organizing this structure, this network of poles or nodes based on which a new form of exchange and transportation would take place. Obviously, this all takes time and a lot of money. So how do you think, or how does the report actually suggest that we should, in the future, think about how to finance this new development model in the region?
So there are many ways of thinking about this. And Brazil really has been a leader in the area of forest protection, in the area of raising financing, conservation financing for forests in the REDD+ space. And that is something to build on. And that's what we try to do. So we build on this story. So for example, the Amazon Fund is a jurisdictional approach where Brazil really has been leading the world in innovative ideas of providing financing that is results-based. So it is linked to reductions in deforestation. We develop ideas based on this idea that financing should really be anchored in results in reducing deforestation. Now, what the report shows, however, is that deforestation pressures, they change every year. So they change based on commodity prices, they change based on the exchange rate, they change based on relative prices across countries. So there are many macroeconomic factors that change every year that also impact deforestation. So if we want to reduce deforestation to zero, we must accept that sometimes the forces that drive deforestation are much stronger than in other years. And to generate incentives that are always consistent across time, to always protect forests, financing needs to be also consistent with the pressures that prevail any year. And this is what the report proposes. It proposes basically a new methodology to estimate what are the deforestation pressures in every year and how much then do we need to pay for zero deforestation. And there are different ways in which this can be done. It can either be linked to the value of the forest, or it can be linked to the opportunity cost of the land that will not be deforested. And this could generate resources from various sources that would be passed on initially, that's what we propose, to the states, to the municipalities, and then down to other stakeholders, including farmers. And the money should obviously, if you follow our logic, also be used to promote exactly this urban productivity that we have been talking about. So what are some of the financing sources that we can consider? So obviously there's a lot of interest globally to support the Amazon. Many countries are donating to Brazil to reduce deforestation. That is a really important source of financing. In addition to that, there is the financial sector that is interested in this. So we are proposing, for example, a sustainability-linked bond that could be generated by the federal government, so issued by the federal government, and the interest rate savings that are generated through measurable deforestation reductions can be passed on again to the Amazon region. And then there are savings within the Brazilian budget. So the World Bank also has been talking for a long time about inefficiencies within the Brazilian budget that could be restructured and then release resources to reward deforestation reductions. And finally, we are drawing attention to the agenda around carbon markets. Carbon markets are still relatively small, especially voluntary carbon markets, but there is a lot of potential for growth that we see. And there might also be possibilities of a Brazilian compliance market where carbon credits could be issued for avoided deforestation in the legal Amazon. And taking all of these sources of financing together, our sense is that significant resources can be generated to reward the legal Amazon to eliminate deforestation.
Marek, we are coming to the end of our dialogue, but I would like to hear you on a point, which seems to be one of the paradoxes of the report, so to speak. So on the one hand, it has become quite clear how the report focuses on the need and the desire and the must of raising productivity so that can actually create this new model of development in the region, and that diminishes the pressure of deforestation. But on the other hand, when it comes to the ways of financing it, all these possibilities that you suggest, they are directed at not producing, at stop putting pressure over the environment, at conserving, but not at actually developing new technologies, new productive techniques, innovations, new enterprises, startups, new medicines, new possibilities in the region. Did I understand well?
I hope that's not the key takeaway from our report. What we're saying is the key message is productivity is good. And productivity just needs to happen across the economy. It needs to happen across Brazil, and it needs to happen across sectors, from the commodity sectors to the more urban sectors to manufacturing and services. Where Brazil has been traditionally weaker are the manufacturing and services sector. And these sectors are very important for a country that's very urbanized because these sectors tend to produce in cities. So a lot of the issues that you find in Brazilian cities, poverty, informal settlements, slums, favelas, all of this is related to a growth model that doesn't generate jobs for urban populations. And to generate growth and jobs in a country like Brazil, it is really important to generate productivity. So that's why we're saying this financing should definitely generate jobs, and it should generate jobs also in these urban areas. And what the report shows, what is very nice, is that this revenue that is linked to measurable reductions in deforestation, if invested in urban productivity, it doesn't only generate jobs, it further reduces deforestation, that generates even more revenue. So it becomes a real win-win situation for the states of the legal Amazon.
Great. So it has been a pleasure to talk with Marek Hanusch, who's a senior economist at the World Bank, and he has coordinated this quite impressive report that touches upon different aspects, challenges of the Amazon, and that has as one of the key drives and key messages, I have to say, that is the key point, the need to increase productivity in the Amazon as a way to create this practical, real reconciliation between the forest, the people, and the development of the region. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time, your attention. It has been a pleasure to talk to you.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Hoje conversamos com Marek Hanusch, economista sênior do Banco Mundial, que coordenou esse estudo abrangente sobre os desafios para o desenvolvimento da Amazônia e que tem como uma das mensagens-chave o desafio de ampliar a produtividade em todos os setores e, assim, reduzir a pressão sobre o desmatamento. A Amazônia é 60% do território brasileiro, a nossa segunda metade, e também será a nossa segunda chance.